From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South, and I'm Carla Gonzalez. Brazil's Supreme Court has narrowly rejected a petition for habeas corpus by the former president Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva. It means Lula is likely to go to prison within the next week. The court session in Brasilia started in the afternoon and went on into the early hours, as each judge explained their vote. In the end, 6 judges voted against Lula and 5 in his favor. Under Brazilian electoral law, a candidate is forbidden from running for elected office for 8 years after being found guilty of a crime. So Lula's conviction would bar him from running in the upcoming presidential elections in October, where he is the front-runner in all opinion polls. A crowd of Lula supporters gathered outside his home in Sao Paulo after the verdict to welcome him home. They recalled how he lifted tens of millions of people out of poverty. During his rule from 2003 to 2010, they are convinced the case against him was invented to prevent him from standing for the election. Lula's Workers' Party said the court's decision was a grave blow to democracy.
We are on Lula's side today, protesting in the street and fighting for democracy.
In a sign of the growing polarization in Brazil, right-wing protesters also took to the streets to celebrate the court's decision. They carried Brazilian flags and sang the national anthem. Some of them had been calling for a military coup if Lula had been allowed to remain free. Earlier in the day, thousands of members of the Brazilian Workers' Party and other social movements marched to the Supreme Court in Brasilia as the judges presented their conclusions. They defended Lula's right to remain a candidate for the presidency, and they criticized the senior generals, including the head of the Brazilian Armed Forces, who had called for Lula to go to prison.
Many of us died so we could be here, so they could be here. Those who want a military regime, they don't know how much we fought, so they could have a right to protest in public. How many died or were tortured so we can protest? That's what is at risk, the right of all of us to take to the streets.
Leaders of the left in Brazil and around the world have condemned the ruling against Lula. The Venezuelan president, Nicolás Maduro, sent a message of support to Lula. "This injustice pains us deeply," he wrote. "The right has chosen the courts to frighten the people, but they will not succeed." While Ecuador's former president, Rafael Correa, also sent a fraternal embrace. "We all know your crime was to lift 30 million Brazilians out of poverty," he said. And the leader of the French left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, tweeted, "What a rotten world. Lula is condemned to 12 years to prevent him from being a candidate, while Macron welcomes the Venezuelan right." Our correspondent in Brasilia, Adriana Robreño, has more on the Supreme Court's decision.
Hola, saludos a todos.
The Brazilian Supreme Federal Tribunal has decided to deny former President Luis Ignacio Lula da Silva his request of habeas corpus. The vote was 6-5 against the former president's request. The Supreme Court's decision has been considered historic in the country, as many say it goes against Article 5 in the Constitution, which says citizens are presumed innocent until proven otherwise, and that they can appeal a court's decision while remaining free. With this decision, the Supreme Court is denying Lula this right. Now the former president has to face an imprisonment order that could become effective at any time. Lula was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The Supreme Court decision is considered by many to be divisive and damaging to democracy, especially as it follows the impeachment of former President Dilma Rousseff in 2016.
That was Adriana Robreño from Brasilia. Bolivia has ordered the extradition of former President Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada and his former Minister of Defense, Carlos Sanchez, from the United States to face justice in Bolivia. Sanchez de Lozada was found guilty of involvement in the massacre of 67 people in 2003 by a court in the United States. Families of the victims celebrated the court's decision, which demands that Sanchez de Lozada compensates relatives with $10 million.
The most important thing is that a jury found Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada and Carlos Sanchez responsible for this massacre. That is what we were fighting for, and we got it. That cannot be changed. Today, the whole world knows that both of them violated human rights.
Peru's Defense Minister José Huerta Torres has been questioned over alleged links to former President Alberto Fujimori and his former advisor, Vladimiro Montesinos, who are accused of human rights violations. This happened just 2 days after President Martín Vizcarra was sworn in along with his new ministerial cabinet. The new defense minister denies he was part of the Fujimori regime and says he did not support the coup the former president organized. Prime Minister César Villanueva says the government backs Huerta Torres and rejects the accusations. In an exclusive interview, Telesur spoke to Vice President-elect of Costa Rica, Epsy Campbell after a historic win, alongside President-elect Carlos Alvarado, defeating a strong campaign by the country's evangelical right.
It was a very important debate because in Costa Rica we were for the first time in history facing a religious party that had set out a number of issues which could have directly affected and violated the rights of the LGBTI population. Not only this, but in Costa Rica there has long been a bond between religion and politics, and during the debates the religious party pushed a political ethic based on a Christian neo-Pentecostal ethic.
We'll take a short break now, but join us again after this look at what our multimedia colleagues are reporting. Welcome back. In the midst of endless murders of social leaders in Colombia, 500 organizations have announced a report on the complex human rights situation in the country.
Social organizations from all over the country published a report on the issue of human rights, prepared for an evaluation process to be submitted to the UN by the Colombian state on May 10th.
Colombia unfortunately has failed on human rights, and we say this sadly because the peace process, the peace agreement with FARC and the start of negotiations with the ELN guerrillas should have given us the possibility of improving the human rights situation and to begin to build a stable and lasting peace. But there continue to be situations that the Colombian state has not been able or has not been willing to overcome in the field of human rights.
Between 2013 and 2017, at least 266 murders and 664 attacks against human rights defenders were registered.
If we review the moment and the place where these killings happened, then it is possible to identify a pattern in the way these murders took place and the motivation behind them.
Human rights supporters are in danger all over the country.
If you are a supporter in Cauca or in Choco, you will definitely be at risk because you are facing off against illegal mining projects or the big mining companies that are affecting the environment and natural resources.
2005's Law of Justice and Peace, promoted by the government of Álvaro Uribe and meant to facilitate the demobilization of paramilitaries, has had zero results after 13 years.
There was enough evidence gathered on third-party liability for the Justice and Peace trial of businessmen, of civil authorities, of military authorities. And now, in 2018, we still don't know the actions brought against these businessmen and against these authorities that were incriminated by the paramilitaries as being involved in crimes.
After so many murders and violence, the Colombian state should start guaranteeing the lives of social leaders and their communities.
Colombia's financial regulator has given FARC members access to financial services. The move came after it learned several banks would not let its members open bank accounts. The regulator said the former combatants must be treated as equal. It added that the party needs to access financial services to reintegrate into civil society. The FARC signed a peace agreement with the government in September 2016 to end hostilities, reform, and unite with the rest of society. Also in Colombia, corruption was the main topic of debate for the 4 presidential candidates. They also discussed other issues, including infrastructure, healthcare, and the environment. The presidential elections are scheduled for May 27. Gustavo Petro and Iván Duque are currently leading in the polls.
What Colombians want are concrete measures against corruption. I want to empower citizens so it is easy for them to report a corruption case. Secondly, we are going to make sure the culprits pay back to the country with every last penny of their fortune. We are going to face them and impose tougher punishments. Also, my government will be transparent, so you will be able to check where our budget goes.
In Colombia, we have the legal tools to fight corruption, even though some believe otherwise. As a lawmaker, I passed 42 bills through Congress, so we do have the tools. What we need is political will to use them.
We cannot lie to ourselves. Corruption gets into power from the electoral campaigns. Look at the pictures. Look at who is linked to each other, and so you can already know how the government is going to rule. So the first step against corruption is not a penny in exchange of a vote, not a contract in exchange of a lawmaker.
And presidential candidate Gustavo Petro focused his speech on healthcare and promised better health services for Colombia.
My first priority is to establish a preventative healthcare system. We will implement primary healthcare all across Colombia until every home in every corner of the country has access to healthcare. By promoting preventative medicine, we will make better use of the budget because prevention reduces costs.
U.S. President Donald Trump has signed an order to deploy National Guard soldiers on the border with Mexico. Trump's decision comes after his complaint against a caravan of hundreds of Central American immigrants heading to the United States. The number of soldiers to be sent to the Mexican border is yet to be determined. And following this announcement, Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto said that his government is awaiting for clarification from Washington before giving a proper response.
It hasn't happened yet, but if that will happen, then Mexico will outline its position. Hopefully, the clarification will arrive soon, so we can orientate our position regarding Trump's decision to militarize the border.
And footage from Wednesday showed hundreds of Central Americans camping at a sports field in Oaxaca earlier this week, after President Trump warned about the caravans of migrants heading to the border. They were seen seeking shelter to protect themselves from the hot afternoon sun. And in the evening, they lit fires to cook their meals. The group of more than 1,000 people advanced along the country, walking near roadsides and train tracks. They are currently waiting to get advice on filing for transit or humanitarian visas in Mexico.
Donald Trump wanted the world to smash us and erase our existence, but we continue and Mexico has responded in a way. We thank Mexico's response. This is a job that we have done every year, and it is respectable, and we really seek ways to stand for sensitive laws.
Social organizations in Mexico have denounced that a multi-million-dollar budget assigned to combat poverty is allegedly being used by the government for electoral campaign.
Pedro has to bring water from miles away in order to prepare some tea. In the Tebajanes, where he has lived for over 20 years, there is no gas delivery, electricity, or drainage system. Many presidential candidates have offered help. Pedro doesn't believe in their promises.
The poor have never been taken into account, quite the opposite. They only take into account those who have money.
Nonetheless, the government has announced it will assign millions to fight poverty, but economist Arturo Huerte doubts the budget will be properly applied.
These resources could be used to develop agriculture, to generate employment. People want jobs, not misery.
The Secretariat of Social Development, which is in charge of social development efforts in the country, was managed by candidate José Antonio Meade.
It's difficult to help those in need, as we managed to do in Sedasol, when 2 million Mexicans were taken out of extreme poverty.
Meade says he has reduced extreme poverty rates under the current government, but official numbers don't back him up. In the last 25 years, the number of people living in poverty has actually increased. It's being calculated that there are more than 60 million Mexicans living in poverty, even though the official budget to combat the issue has tripled during the same period.
In Guatemala, the Supreme Court of Justice has refused to withdraw presidential immunity from the country's leader, Jimmy Morales. Morales is under scrutiny for his alleged responsibility in the deaths of 41 girls who lost their lives when a state home burned down in March 2017. The spokesman of the court, Angel Pineda, said that the plenary found the complaint lodged against the president to be political and spurious. Dominica's opposition United Workers' Party is one member down in the lower house of parliament. One of the MPs has resigned from the party, but he says he'll stay in the parliament as an independent candidate. Joseph Isaac, the parliamentary representative for Rousseau Central, stepped down, saying it would be better for his constituents if he continued as an independent. He says that way he can vote on bills based on his conscience and not his party. Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerritt's Dominica Labour Party holds 15 of the 21 seats of the parliament. Argentina's Football Association says it will monitor boarding houses where young players live. This following a sex scandal involving minors at two of the country's most popular soccer clubs, including River Plate and Independiente. Buenos Aires Attorney General Julio Conte Ground is also looking into the matter. He said in several cases, young boys were offered public transportation cards, among other things, in exchange for sexual favors. He added that the number of victims may increase as investigation continues.
There are at least 10 more possible victims, but we won't stop at that. We will continue to investigate, as there may be more victims.
Land Express, a subsidiary of the LATAM Airlines Group, is canceling flights in Chile next week in preparation for collective bargaining meetings and the possibility of a strike action. The talks between the cabin crew and management ended on Monday. If there's a strike, it is expected to begin the next day. The airline says it's canceling flights from April 10 to 13 as the precautionary measure to minimize the impact that a strike could have on its passengers. The situation would only affect routes within Chile, and they hope there will be minimal impacts on flights within South America. We'll take another short break, but join us after this look at what our multimedia colleagues are reporting.
also take appropriate administrative and disciplinary action.
Enemies of freedom committed an act of war against our country.
We came, we saw, he died.
Welcome. I think we are ready to start. And welcome to this
Welcome back. In a new disclosure, Facebook says the privacy of more than 87 million users was compromised by the British data mining company Cambridge Analytica. The figure was reported to be 50 million 2 weeks ago. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg says a search feature on Facebook that enabled people to extract information was misused. Zuckerberg will answer questions at an inquiry by the U.S. House Committee on Energy and Commerce next week. Now let's have a look at some other stories making headlines from around the world.
The first group of US diplomats expelled from Russia have left the US embassy in Moscow. In a tit-for-tat action, Moscow has expelled 60 US diplomats. Washington expelled the Russian envoys over allegations that Russia poisoned a former Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter in the UK. In another development in the spy poisoning row, Russia has lost a bid for a joint investigation with Britain at the Global Chemical Weapons Watchdog, OPCW, in The Hague. Moscow has now called for an urgent UN Security Council talks to press its case at the highest level.
23 countries have refused to associate themselves with the Western point of view. They either voted in favor of our draft decision or abstained. 23 countries, that is more than half of all members of the Executive Council.
Julius Maada Bio, an opposition candidate and former military junta leader, has been sworn in as Sierra Leone's new president. He took over 51% of the total votes against the close rival Samura Kamara of the ruling party. Maada Bio served as the head of a military regime in 1996. After taking the oath, he said he will promote national unity and disciplined leadership.
Freezing temperatures in Britain last month forced hundreds of homeless people to take refuge in an abandoned building in the centre of London. But the centre has now been forced to close, leaving many out in the cold. Paolo Navarrete went there to see what happened.
On the 1st of March in central London, as temperatures plummeted across Britain, activists set up a makeshift shelter in a disused central London building. Dubbed the Sophia Solidarity Centre, up to 200 rough sleepers arrived each night to seek shelter, food and warmth.
It's not just that homelessness is increasingly, it really is a crisis. I believe at last count there were over 150 people here last night. Those people would be out in the streets. Those people would be out in the snow in freezing temperatures. A lot of them would be dying. Whereas here it's warm, the lights are on, they can charge their phones, they can socialise, get hot meals.
After nearly 3 weeks of providing much needed shelter and food, the centre was forced to close. Its residents were driven out by a court order and the threat of bailiffs, forcing them to leave. The volunteers say they knew this might happen at any moment.
These individuals have nothing. And you're closing down places all over the place. And there's no place for people to go. If the door closes on this, they're back out again.
The centre's doors have now closed, but Britain's homelessness crisis continues. More than 300,000 people, Equivalent to 1 in every 200 are officially recorded as homeless or living in inadequate homes, according to figures released by the housing and homelessness charity Shelter, a rise of 13,000 over the past year.
So rough sleeping, homelessness, the people you see asking for money on the streets, is really just a visible sign of a much, much deeper crisis. For every person you see sleeping on the streets, there are dozens, hundreds, maybe thousands behind them, not knowing if that's going to be what happens to them next. Because people become homeless as a result of government policy, which has been to cut away, to eradicate the safety nets that many people relied on.
Since the Sophia Centre closed, the British government has announced that it will allocate $42 million to break what they call the homelessness cycle once and for all. Those behind the Sophia Centre call this a drop in the ocean, and it is difficult to see how this amount will address in any meaningful way the homelessness crisis facing Britain today. Pablo Navarrete, Telesur, London.
In Syria, 2 brothers are restoring an Aleppo church to its former glory. The Catholic building was partly destroyed during the ongoing civil war. Nemat and Bashir Badawi set themselves a 100-day deadline to complete their mission of painstakingly repairing iconic murals. They are now working on the Assumption of Mary, which shows Virgin Mary ascending into heaven, surrounded by angels. Aleppo is in the process of returning to normal after being liberated from the Islamic State. And we've come to the end of this news brief. This and many other stories, you can find them on our website, telesurtv.net/English. And you can also follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Carla Gonzalez. Thank you for watching.